There is a unique power in a justice that arrives with a velvet touch and a perfectly steady hand at the end. Witness the smooth, calculated paths of those who finally found their peace after a lifetime of hard struggle. Hit subscribe now and see the price of truth.
I'm glad you're here with me today. Stay until the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I need to know someone out there is listening. My son looked me straight in the eye at my own kitchen table and said, "Mom, you need to stop treating this like a crisis every time something doesn't go your way. We have lives." My daughter nodded along like I wasn't even in the room, and my other son just stared at his phone. I had just told them that their father's bakery, the one he built with his own hands, the one I had kept running for 6 years after he died, was being circled by a developer who wanted to tear it down and put up condominiums. I needed advice. I needed my children. Instead, I got 3 adults who couldn't wait to leave my house, so I handled it myself. I called my attorney. I made my decisions, and I protected what was mine. And 6 months later, when all 3 of them showed up at that bakery on a Saturday morning with a real estate broker and a letter from their own lawyer, they found my attorney already sitting at the corner table with a cup of coffee and a folder full of documents they were not expecting. The looks on their faces, I will carry that moment with me for the rest of my life, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. Because this isn't just a story about a bakery or an inheritance. It's about the moment I finally understood what I had built and what I had accidentally broken over the course of 67 years of trying my hardest to love people the right way. My name is Donna, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I have lived here my whole life. In the same neighborhood where I grew up, married, raised 3 children, and buried my husband. My husband Carl passed away 6 years ago from a heart attack. He was 64 years old, standing behind the counter of the bakery he had opened when he was 28. When he simply sat down on the stool, he kept near the register and didn't get back up. Carl's bakehouse had been open for 36 years when he died. It was not a fancy place. Butcher paper on the tables, mismatched chairs, the smell of cinnamon and yeast so deep in the walls that you could close your eyes and think it was 1987. Carl made everything from scratch. His sourdough had a 6-year-old starter. He kept alive, like it was a member of the family. His cinnamon rolls were the reason people drove 40 minutes on Sunday mornings. After he died, I kept it open. Everyone told me not to. My children told me to sell it. My friends told me it would be too hard. But I had worked beside Carl for 36 years. And I knew every recipe, every vendor, every regular customer by name. Closing it felt like losing him twice. So I stayed. For the first 2 years, my youngest son, Marcus, helped on weekends. My daughter, Linda, came by occasionally, usually when she wanted something to bring to a dinner party. My oldest son, Greg, never set foot inside unless he was picking up a box of pastries to take to his office. But they all had opinions about what I should do with the place. The developer's name was Patterson. He came in one Tuesday morning in October, ordered a coffee he didn't drink, and slid a business card across the counter. He said the building sat on a corner lot that his company had been watching for 2 years. He named a number that made my hands go still on the counter. He said to think about it. That night, I called my children, Greg first, because he always wanted to be consulted first. He answered on the 3rd ring, distracted, the sound of a television behind him. I told him about Patterson. I told him the number. I said I didn't know what to do, and I needed to talk it through. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mom, honestly, this might be the right move. You're 67. How long are you going to keep doing this?" I told him I wasn't ready to stop. He said, "I'm not saying stop living. I'm saying stop working so hard. Sell it. Invest the money. Enjoy yourself." I asked him if we could talk more tomorrow. if he might come by the bakery. He said he had a full week. I called Linda next. She had more energy for the conversation, but all of it pointed in one direction. She said the building was old, the neighborhood was changing, and that I should think about what Dad would have wanted for me, not for the bakery. When I started to cry a little, she said, "Mom, please don't do this. You always make everything so emotional." I called Marcus last. He was the gentlest of the three. He said he was sorry. That sounded stressful, and that he'd try to come by sometime that week. He never did. I sat at my kitchen table that night, with Carl's old recipe binder open in front of me. Not reading it, just touching it. I had kept this bakery alive through 6 Oregon winters, through a pandemic, through 2 floods in the basement, through a fire in the oven that took 3 months and every dollar in my savings to repair, and not one of my children had ever once said, "Mom, thank you for keeping Dad's place going." They hadn't needed to. I always told myself they were busy. They had their own lives. That was how I had raised them to be independent, to not need me for every little thing. But sitting there that night, I started to wonder if I had made a mistake somewhere. Not in raising them to be independent, but in teaching them that I didn't need anything in return, that I was a resource, not a person, that the bakery and I would always just be there. The next morning, I opened at 6 as usual, and at 7:15, my niece Sophie came through the door. Sophie was my younger brother's daughter. She was 34, recently divorced, raising her 6-year-old girl Maisie, mostly alone since her ex-husband had moved to Arizona. She had started coming by the bakery 3 years ago, just to talk at first, then to help on busy mornings, then more and more until she was there almost every day. I paid her what I could, which was never enough. But she never complained. Sophie had a gift for the work. She learned Carl's sourdough method from a notebook I showed her once and replicated it almost perfectly within a month. She talked to the regulars like old friends. She remembered which customers were gluten-free, which ones were diabetic, which ones had just lost a spouse and needed someone to sit with them for a few minutes over a cup of coffee. I told her about Patterson. She put down the tray she was carrying and looked at me. "What do you want to do?" she asked. That was the first time anyone had asked me that. I told her I didn't want to sell. I told her I thought about Carl every single day in that kitchen, and I wasn't ready to let that go. And then I told her what Greg and Linda and Marcus had said. Sophie was quiet. She refilled my coffee without being asked. Then she said, "Aunt Donna, can I say something that might be hard to hear?" I told her to go ahead. She said, "I don't think they're asking what you want. I think they're thinking about what they'll eventually inherit and whether now is better than later." I didn't say anything, but I didn't tell her she was wrong. I called my attorney, a woman named Ruth Calloway. That same afternoon, Ruth had handled Carl's estate and had been my lawyer for 11 years. I told her about Patterson, about my children's reactions, about the creeping feeling I had that something was shifting around me that I couldn't quite see yet. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Donna, when did you last update your will?" I said right after Carl died. She said, "Come in this week. Let's talk about where things stand and what your options are." I went on Thursday. Ruth's office was small and warm and smelled like old paper. She had a plant on her windowsill that had been dying for as long as I had known her and somehow never quite died. I found that comforting. We went through everything. The bakery building, which I owned outright. The house, Carl's small life insurance policy, which I had mostly spent, keeping the bakery going in the first 2 years. My retirement accounts. The sum of it was more than I sometimes remembered. Mostly because of how much the property had appreciated. Ruth asked me what I intended to leave to each of my children. I said I had always planned to divide everything equally among the 3 of them. The bakery, the building, the house. All of it split 3 ways. Ruth asked me if that was still what I wanted. I sat with that question for a long time. Long enough that Ruth got up and poured us both water without saying anything. Finally, I said, "I don't know anymore." She said, "That's an honest answer. Tell me why." I told her everything. The phone calls. The years of coming by only when they needed something. The way they talked about the bakery as a burden or an asset, never as a piece of their father. The fact that it was Sophie who showed up every day. Sophie who knew every customer. Sophie who had cried in the parking lot on the anniversary of Carl's death when she thought I wasn't watching. Ruth made notes. She didn't react visibly to anything I said, which was one of the things I valued most about her. When I finished, she said, "I want you to go home and think about this carefully. Not in anger, not in grief. Come back in 2 weeks and tell me what you've decided. Whatever you decide. We'll make it airtight." I went home and thought about it for 2 weeks. What I kept coming back to was this: the bakery was not just a building. It was Carl's life's work. It was the place where my children had done homework at the corner table, where I had told them their grandfather died, where Greg had his first job at 14 washing dishes in the back. If I left it to the 3 of them equally, I knew exactly what would happen. Greg would want to sell immediately. Linda would agree because the money would be useful. Marcus would go along because he always went along. The building would be gone within a year. And Carl's sourdough starter would end up in the trash. Sophie would keep it going. I knew that the way I knew the smell of bread baking. She would keep it going because she loved it, not because of what it was worth. I went back to Ruth and I told her what I wanted. The bakery building and the business would go to Sophie outright. The house would go into a trust that I controlled until my death, at which point it would be split among my children. Each of my children would receive $25,000 and one personal item of Carl's choosing: his watch for Greg, his first recipe binder for Linda, his old bread knife for Marcus. Ruth said, "Your children will contest this." I said, "I know. Make it so they can't win." She spent the next 3 weeks building what she later described to me as a fortress. Cognitive assessment by a neuropsychologist. Video testimony. A letter from my primary care physician. Documentation of the bakery's operational history, showing my active management. Documentation of Sophie's contributions. A clause specifying that any contest of the will would result in the contesting party forfeiting even the $25,000. I filmed the video testimony on a Tuesday afternoon in Ruth's office. She set up a camera and left me alone with it. I had tried to prepare what I wanted to say, but in the end I just talked. I said, "My name is Donna Marsh. I am 67 years old. I am of sound mind. I am changing my will not because I don't love my children, but because love is not the only thing that matters when you are deciding who should be trusted with the thing you love most. The bakery should go to someone who will protect it, not liquidate it. Sophie will protect it. I have watched her do it for 3 years. That is all." When Ruth turned the camera off, she said it was the clearest video testimony she had ever recorded. I did not tell my children any of this. I did not tell Sophie either. Not yet. Ruth advised me to stay quiet until the time was right. I agreed. Months passed. The developer Patterson came back twice more, with slightly higher numbers. I told him each time that I wasn't interested. He left his card again both times, which I put in a drawer. With the first one, then, in February, Greg called me on a Sunday evening. He said he and Linda wanted to come over that week to talk. He said it was important. He used a tone I didn't recognize at first. Too careful. Too even. Like he was reading from something he had written down. They came on Wednesday. Marcus came too, which surprised me. All 3 of them together on a Wednesday night was unusual enough that I had baked a coffee cake. The old habit of feeding people whenever I was nervous. Greg sat at the head of my kitchen table, where Carl used to sit, and I noticed that he had brought a folder. He opened it and placed 3 documents in front of me. He said they had been talking, the three of them, and they were concerned. He said I had been under tremendous stress for 6 years. He said the bakery was more than one person should be managing at my age. He said they wanted to help by taking a more active role in managing the family assets. The documents were power of attorney forms. I looked at them. I looked at my son. I looked at Linda, who was staring at the coffee cake. I looked at Marcus, who was looking at the floor. I said, "Active role." Greg said yes. He said it would give them the ability to help with decisions around the property and the business. He said it was just to make things easier. I asked him when any of them had last set foot in the bakery to help. He said that wasn't the point. I asked what the point was. He said, "Mom, Patterson has made 3 offers now. At some point we have to think practically. You're not going to run that bakery forever." Linda said, "We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to protect you." I looked at the documents again. I am a woman who worked alongside her husband for 36 years in a business that required you to read people clearly which suppliers were honest, which customers were having a hard week, which employees needed a kind word, and which ones needed a firm one. I had been reading people my whole life. I knew exactly what those documents were for. I said, "I'd like you to leave." Greg said, "Mom," I said, "I'm not signing anything tonight, and I'd like you to leave." They left. Greg was irritated. Linda looked like she had expected this. Marcus hugged me on the way out and whispered, "I'm sorry," so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I called Ruth from the kitchen before I'd even cleared the coffee cake. She said, "Don't sign anything. Don't meet with them alone again, if you can help it." "And Donna, it's time." I asked. Time for what? She said. "Time to tell Sophie." Sophie came over the next morning before her shift. I made her sit down, which she resisted because she is always in motion. I told her about the will. I told her about the bakery, the building, all of it. She stared at me for a long time. Then she said, "Aunt Donna, I can't accept that." I told her she could and she would. She said, "They'll blame me. They'll think I manipulated you." I said, "Sophie, you have been here every single day for 3 years. You know which shelf the backup vanilla is on. You know that the oven in the back runs 12 degrees hot. You know Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter is lactose intolerant, and to put the oat milk out when she comes in. My children cannot tell me what we charge for a loaf of sourdough. That is not manipulation. That is love. And love should mean something." Sophie pressed her hands flat on the table the way she does when she's trying to hold herself together. I said, "Don't cry yet. I need you to be ready because things are about to get harder before they get easier." She asked what she should do. I said, "Keep showing up. That's all. Keep showing up." 3 weeks later, I received a certified letter. It was a formal notice that my children had retained an attorney and were exploring a petition related to my capacity to manage my own affairs. The letter cited my recent behavior as evidence of impaired judgment, including my refusal to consider the developer's offers, my increased reliance on a non-family member in the management of business assets, and what they described as erratic responses during family communications. Ruth called me before I'd finished reading it. She said, "We expected this. The documentation is solid. Their case is extremely weak. But Donna, I need to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Do you want to know why they're really doing this? Not what they're telling themselves, but the real reason, because I have a colleague who does financial investigation work, and I can find out. It might help us understand if there's any path to resolution here that doesn't involve a courtroom." I thought about that. I thought about Marcus whispering "I'm sorry" on the way out. I thought about the fact that none of them were bad people. Exactly. They had just learned somehow to treat me as something permanent and inexhaustible, like the bakery itself. Something that would always be there no matter how little attention they paid it. I said yes. What Ruth's colleague found took 2 weeks and broke my heart. Greg had made a significant investment 3 years ago in a business venture that had collapsed. He had lost most of his retirement savings and had not told his wife, who believed they were financially secure. He was carrying nearly $180,000 in personal debt and had been quietly terrified for years. Linda's husband had been laid off 18 months ago. She had not told any of us. They had 2 kids in private school and a mortgage on a house that had been purchased, assuming 2 incomes. She had been covering everything alone, working extra consulting hours on nights and weekends, and was stretched to a breaking point. Marcus was the one I had not expected. Marcus. My quiet one. My gentle one. He had a gambling problem. It had started as sports betting 3 years ago and had quietly become something serious. He was in debt to the kind of people who don't use attorneys to collect. None of them had told me any of this. I sat with Ruth's report in my kitchen at the same table where they had put those power of attorney forms in front of me, and I cried. Not because I was angry at them, though I was, but because they had all been drowning in secret while I stood 20 minutes away baking bread. And not one of them had trusted me enough to say so. I thought about all the times I had told them not to worry. I was fine. Everything was handled. I thought about all the times a problem they'd brought to me had somehow ended with me making them feel guilty for having the problem in the first place, even when I didn't mean to. I thought about how I had shaped this family into a particular shape where I was the one who held things up and they were the ones who received. And somewhere along the way, without anyone deciding it, receiving had become the only thing they knew how to do. I did not excuse what they were doing, but I began to understand it. I called Greg first. He answered with a careful voice. The prepared one, I said. I know about the investment. Greg, I know how much you lost. The silence that followed was the longest silence I had ever shared with my son. He finally said, how I said it didn't matter. I said, why didn't you tell me? He said, because you would have been disappointed. Because you would have looked at me the way you always look at us when we mess up. Like we've let Dad down. That hit me somewhere I didn't expect. I called Linda. She cried almost immediately, which Linda never does. She said she had been so ashamed. She said she thought she could fix it before anyone noticed. She said she was exhausted in a way that sleep didn't touch anymore. I called Marcus last. He didn't answer. He called back 40 minutes later, and his voice was flat in a way that frightened me. I said, Marcus, I need you to tell me the truth. He did. It came out of him like something that had been waiting a long time to come out. He told me about the betting. He told me about the debt. He told me about the men who had called his work number twice. He was crying by the end, and so was I. He said, I was going to tell you. I kept thinking I could fix it first. I said, you can't fix it first. You need help first. He said, I know. I sat at my kitchen table that night and thought about my husband. Carl had a saying that I used to think was overly simple. You can't bake bread in a cold oven. He meant you have to create the right conditions first, before anything good can happen. You can't skip the preparation and expect the result. I thought about the conditions I had created in this family. I had always been there, but I had not always been approachable. I had always given, but I had not always made it easy to ask. I had baked all the bread and kept the oven warm for everyone else, but I had never taught them how to tend the fire themselves. That was on me. Not all of it, but enough of it that I owed them honesty. I called Ruth and told her what I had found. Then I told her what I wanted to do. She said, this is your decision. Make sure it's coming from the right place. I said, it's coming from Carl's saying about the oven. She paused, then said, I'll take your word for it. The text from Greg came on a Friday. Short and formal. We'd like to meet at the bakery this Saturday at noon to discuss the family's concerns about the property. Please be available. Not a request. A summons. I called Sophie that evening. I told her what was happening. I told her to be at the bakery at 11. I told her it would be okay. She said, "What if it isn't?" I said. "Then we deal with that too. But it will be okay." Saturday morning, I drove to the bakery early and unlocked before anyone arrived. I stood in the kitchen for a while by myself, the way I sometimes did. I put my hand on the big mixer that Carl had bought in 1994. I looked at the shelf where he kept his first recipe cards, laminated now, because I had done that the year after he died. I looked at the photo above the door, Carl and me on opening day, 28 and 26 years old. Both of us covered in flour. Both of us, so certain that whatever came next, we could handle it. I thought I still could. Sophie arrived at 11 with Maisie, who immediately went to the corner table with her coloring book. Ruth arrived at 11:15 with her briefcase. She sat up at the counter, documents organized neatly, and she poured herself a coffee because she had been a client of this bakery for 11 years, and she knew where everything was, at noon exactly. My children arrived together. They had brought Greg's attorney, which I had expected. They had also brought a second man I didn't recognize, who turned out to be a real estate broker. Hatterson's company's broker. Greg stopped when he saw Ruth. He said, "What is she doing here?" Ruth said pleasantly. "I was invited. You're welcome to sit down." They sat. Greg's attorney stayed standing. The real estate broker sat near the door looking uncomfortable. Greg said, "Mom, we want to talk about the future of this property." I said, "Okay." He said they had been in contact with the development company. He said the offer had increased significantly. He said at my age, with the amount of work involved in running the bakery, it made far more sense to sell, invest the proceeds, and let the family use those resources going forward. He placed a document on the table. It was a consent to sale, requiring my signature. I looked at the document. I looked at my 3 children, Greg with his careful face and his terrible secret, Linda with her exhausted eyes, Marcus, who was not looking at me, who was looking at Maisie coloring in the corner. I said, "I want to tell you all something before we go any further." Greg said, "Mom," I said, "please." He stopped. I said, "I know what's been happening with each of you. I know about the debt. Greg, I know about the layoff. Linda, I know about the gambling. Marcus?" No one spoke. Maisie's crayon moved across her paper. The street outside was quiet, the way Portland streets get quiet in February. I said, "I'm not telling you I know these things to shame you. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I already tried to handle this the wrong way, keeping my will a secret, working with my attorney behind your backs, letting things come to a confrontation that we could have avoided. That was wrong of me. I should have called you all 6 months ago and said, 'I see that you're struggling. Let's actually talk.'" Linda's face crumpled. Greg went very still. I said, "But I need you to understand something too. What you have been doing? Trying to take control of this property. Bringing a real estate broker to my bakery. Treating me like a problem to be managed, rather than a person who might have something to say that is not love. That is fear wearing love's clothes." Marcus put his head in his hands. I said, "So here is where we are. Ruth is going to explain what I have done with my will. After that, I'm going to make you an offer. You can take it or leave it. But it's the only offer I'm making." Ruth opened her folder and spoke for about 5 minutes. She explained the will, clearly the bakery and the building, to Sophie. The house in trust, $25,000 and one of Carl's possessions to each of them. She explained the cognitive assessment, the video testimony, the documentation. She said with the precision of someone who enjoyed her work that any legal challenge would be both expensive and unsuccessful. Greg's attorney leaned over and said something quietly to him. Greg nodded once. Sophie had gone very still at the counter. Maisie looked up from her coloring and then went back to it. Greg said, "You're giving the bakery to her." I said, "I'm giving the bakery to the person who showed up for it." Linda said, almost a whisper, "This is because we didn't come around enough." I said, "This is because Sophie loves this place for what it is, and the three of you love it for what it's worth. Those are different things, and they produce different stewards." Greg's jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he was going to say the thing I feared. The version of the truth that would be too ugly to come back from. But he looked at Marcus. And then he looked at the photo above the door. And something in his face shifted. He said, "What's the offer?" I said, "Here is what I will do. I will pay Greg's debt in full. Azeloan. Documented properly. With a repayment plan we agree on together. I will help Linda with 3 months of expenses while her husband finds new work, and I will help pay for the kids' remaining school year. For Marcus, I will not give money directly, but I will pay for whatever treatment program he chooses, and I will cover his immediate debt to prevent any further escalation, on the condition that he enters a program within 30 days. In exchange, you drop the petition. You withdraw this." I nodded at the consent to sale. "And you all agree to come to family counseling with me for 6 months. Not to perform a reconciliation for anyone's benefit. To actually learn how to talk to each other." Linda was crying. Greg was not. But his eyes were bright. Marcus lifted his head and looked at me for the first time all morning. He said, "You do all that. After everything." I said, "You're my children. This is not a simple thing. What's between us? We built something complicated together over a lot of years, and it has to be undone carefully or it doesn't get undone at all." Greg said, "The will stays the same." I said, "The will stays the same." He looked at Sophie. Sophie looked back at him without flinching. He said, "She'd really keep this place going." I said, "She already has been." Greg was quiet for a long time, long enough that his attorney shifted his weight twice. Then he picked up the consent to sale and folded it in half. He said, "Okay." Linda said, "Okay." Marcus just nodded. Greg's attorney and the real estate broker let themselves out. Ruth stayed long enough to take notes and shake my hand and tell me she was proud of me, which was not something she usually said. Then she left too. And it was just family. Maisie had put down her crayons and was watching us with the bright, uncertain attention of a 6-year-old who knows something important just happened, but isn't sure what. Sophie came out from behind the counter, and I saw Greg look at her and then look away. Embarrassed. I said, "She saved the sourdough starter once when I forgot to feed it for 4 days. Carl would have loved her." Greg made a sound that was almost a laugh. We stayed at the bakery for 2 more hours. We ordered sandwiches from the place across the street. We talked. Not well. Not smoothly. But honestly in a way that we had not managed in years. Linda told us about her husband's job search. The real version, not the edited one. Greg told us more about the investment. How it had happened. How ashamed he had been. Marcus didn't say much, but he stayed. Which was its own thing. Sophie and Maisie sat at the corner table and ate quietly and let us have the space we needed. At one point, Maisie brought her coloring book over and showed me a picture she had drawn of a bakery. Round loaves lined up in a window. A woman with gray hair behind the counter. She said, "That's you, Grandma Donna." She had been calling me that for a year. I had never told her to stop. I said, "That's a very good bakery." She said, "Mama says it has the best bread." I looked at Sophie over Maisie's head, and Sophie smiled in the way she has. Small and certain. The way Carl used to smile. The petition was withdrawn the following week. Marcus checked into an outpatient treatment program 10 days after our meeting, which was within the 30 days, and which was entirely his own decision. made faster than I had expected. Greg and I signed a loan agreement with Ruth as witness. Linda and I talked on the phone 3 times that week. Actual conversations, not check-ins. We started counseling in March. A therapist named Dr. Okafor, who had an office near the river and who did not let us be polite with each other. She made us say the hard things. Greg had to say that he had resented Carl's bakery his whole life because he felt invisible next to it. Linda had to say that she had always felt like she was competing with Sophie for my affection, even though that was not something she had ever admitted to herself. Marcus had to say that the gambling had started the year Carl died, and that some part of him had felt like he deserved to lose things. I had to say that I had built a family where I was the source of everything, and had then been hurt when they treated me like a source. Dr. Okafor said that was the most important sentence anyone had said in her office in 6 months. I didn't know if that was a compliment or a diagnosis. Maybe both. The bakery stayed open. Sophie took over the books officially in April and found 3 inefficiencies in the ordering system. Within a week, that saved us $400 a month. She hired a part-time baker named Thomas, who turned out to have a gift for laminated dough, which had always been Carl's weakness. The sourdough stayed exactly as it had always been. In June, Greg came in on a Saturday morning, not to talk to me. Or not only that, he put on an apron and washed dishes for 4 hours. The way he had at 14. He didn't make a big thing of it. He just showed up. Linda started coming on Sunday afternoons with her kids, who it turned out had never known this was their grandfather's bakery, because she had never told them. She told them in April. Her daughter, who was 12, asked if she could learn to make the cinnamon rolls. Sophie said yes. Marcus completed his program in August. He came to the bakery on his first day out and stood in the doorway for a moment before walking in, like he was deciding something. Then he came to the counter and ordered a coffee and one of Carl's cinnamon rolls and sat in the corner and just existed there for a while, which I understood was its own kind of work. I am 68 now. I still open on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the slower days, because I am not ready to stop entirely, and I don't think I ever will be. The bakery does not need me the way it used to. It has Sophie. And Sophie has Maisie sitting at the corner table most afternoons with her homework. And the sourdough starter is now 7 years old and going strong. My children and I are not the family I imagined when they were small. We are something more uneven than that. More honest. More careful with each other. Greg calls on Sundays. Linda texts too much and calls too little, but she's working on it. Marcus and I have coffee on the first Wednesday of every month. Just the 2 of us. And we talk about real things. Carl's recipe binder is still on the shelf in the kitchen. His bread knife is in Marcus's kitchen drawer in his apartment. His watch is on Greg's wrist, which I noticed last Sunday for the first time. A small silver thing that had always lived in Carl's top drawer. I asked Greg when he started wearing it. He said, "After the bakery meeting, I figured someone should." I thought about what Carl would say if he could see us now. He would probably not say anything grand. He would pour everyone coffee and put a tray of something warm on the table, and he would say, "Okay, we're all here. Let's get started." That was always how he began things. "Okay, we're all here. I think we're getting there."